The story begins with a single image, a sepia-toned photograph taken in 1872 inside a modest parlor in rural Pennsylvania. A girl of no more than 12 years old, Emily Crawford, sits stiffly in a wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap. But the longer you look at the photo, the more wrong it feels. Behind her, faintly blurred yet unmistakably present, stand three figures, not parents, not siblings. Their clothes are not of the 19th century, and their faces, though pale, are stretched in impossible ways, as though half-formed. The photograph was dismissed as an exposure error, but locals whispered of something else, that the Crawford family's youngest daughter had a gift, or more accurately, a curse. Emily spoke with voices no one else could hear. She named strangers who had been buried decades before. She described the private sins of ministers, judges, and businessmen. She would speak in a low, rasping tone that did not belong to a child, and then suddenly the family disappeared. Their farmhouse boarded, their name struck from church records. Emily Crawford vanished into silence. This is not a ghost story, it is a record of erasure, a story of a girl who pierced the veil and was silenced for it. Tonight, we descend into the hidden history of Emily Crawford, the girl medium who spoke with the spirits in 1872. The Crawfords lived on the outskirts of Millhaven, a farming town whose soil was as fertile as it was bloodstained. Millhaven had been a staging point for the Underground Railroad, but also the site of lynchings. It was a town where prosperity depended on silence, where history was deliberately rewritten, erased, or buried. The family kept to themselves: Jonathan Crawford, a blacksmith, his wife Margaret, a seamstress, two older sons who died of fever in childhood, and then Emily, born sickly but sharp-eyed, the last of their line. Neighbors whispered that she was strange from the very beginning. When other children played in the yard, Emily dug shallow holes in the dirt, arranging stones in spirals, murmuring to herself. She often stopped mid-sentence to listen, head tilted as though catching some invisible conversation. At first, townsfolk thought it was harmless imagination, but then Emily began reciting names of those who had died, names no child could have known. She repeated conversations whispered behind locked doors. She knew when cattle would be born still, when barns would collapse in storms, when pregnancies would end in blood. The church labeled her possessed, but possession was only one explanation. The truth was darker. Emily was listening to something the town itself had tried to bury, and it was beginning to answer. In February of 1872, Emily's mother Margaret arranged a gathering inside their parlor. She had heard whispers of wealthy families paying for spiritual mediums in Philadelphia and New York. Perhaps Emily's condition could bring them fortune, or at least explanation. A minister, a judge, and three other prominent men attended. The lights were dimmed, the shutters closed. Emily was seated in the center of the room, a Bible placed on the table before her. She refused to touch it. Instead, she placed her hands palm down on the wooden surface and began to hum low, rhythmic, almost mechanical. Her eyes rolled back and her lips parted. When she spoke, it was not in her own voice. It was guttural, male, ancient. The men shifted uneasily. Emily began naming them one by one, reciting details of sins they had never confessed. The minister's secret visits to a servant's quarters, the judge's role in covering up a lynching. She spoke not only of the deeds, but of the smells, the sweat, the terror of the victims. The men fled. Only her mother remained, trembling. Emily fell silent, then looked up, smiling faintly. "They told me," she said, "that I will speak for them until I am no longer allowed to." Word spread quickly, but not in newspapers. Millhaven prided itself on being untouched by scandal. To acknowledge Emily was to acknowledge what she had revealed, that the very foundations of the town's prosperity were built on secrecy and cruelty. The church branded her an abomination. The Crawfords stopped attending services. Families forbade their children from playing with her. Emily became a shadow in her own town, seen walking along the edges of fields, murmuring to the air. But denial breeds pressure, and pressure breaks. Soon, small accidents began to plague Millhaven. A bell tower collapsed during Mass. Livestock were found mutilated in their stalls. Children vanished into the woods, only to return days later unable to speak of where they had gone. And always, Emily seemed to know before it happened. When asked how, she simply said, "They tell me." Not long after the seance, Emily was taken by her mother to the St. Agnes orphanage, a crumbling brick institution at the edge of Millhaven. Margaret hoped the sisters there might pray for her daughter, cleanse her of whatever spoke through her. The nuns gathered in the chapel, children watching from the pews as Emily knelt at the altar. But instead of prayer, Emily began to laugh, softly at first, then with a growing, ragged force that echoed in the rafters. "You buried them," she said suddenly, pointing at the floorboards beneath the altar. "But their mouths are still open." The sisters froze. One of them, the oldest, began to tremble, for she knew Emily spoke truth. Years earlier, when disease had swept through the orphanage, the bodies of children were not properly buried. They were sealed beneath the chapel itself to save money. Emily clawed at the wooden boards until her nails split. The children screamed, and from the silence that followed came a smell, sweet, rotting. The priests ordered Margaret to take Emily away immediately. Within days, the orphanage closed its doors, but the nuns did not speak of what Emily had uncovered. Their silence was bought with threats, with fear, and with the knowledge that the girl had spoken the unspeakable. The Reverend Samuel Whittaker of Millhaven Baptist was not a man easily shaken, but after Emily exposed the orphanage secret, he came to the Crawford home in private. He spoke in low tones, as if someone might be listening. He told Margaret that Emily must be silenced, not for blasphemy, but for the sake of the town. "She sees what should not be seen," he whispered, "and if she continues, she will not only destroy us, she will destroy herself." Margaret begged for guidance. The Reverend offered a solution. The church would arrange for Emily to be sent away to a sanitarium in Philadelphia where doctors could study her condition. Margaret hesitated, but Jonathan, never practical, saw no other way. Emily, listening from the stairwell, said nothing. Only later did she murmur, "He is afraid because they speak his name too." The Reverend left the Crawford home that night pale, shaken. Some said he never preached the same again. His sermons grew erratic, warning of damnation, trembling as though unseen eyes watched him from every pew. Within months he vanished. His carriage was found abandoned on the road to Pittsburgh. His Bible lay open on the seat, a single phrase underlined in red, "And the dead shall speak." By late 1872, Emily no longer spoke in single voices. She spoke in many, sometimes in rapid succession, as though a crowd pressed against her throat, sometimes all at once, her lips moving but the sound swelling from the walls, the windows, the air itself. Neighbors reported hearing her voice outside their homes at night, calling them by name, revealing sins they had long forgotten. Families bolted their doors, but still the whispers came, through cracks, through chimneys, through dreams. Margaret began to unravel. She prayed over Emily's bed, weeping, while Jonathan drowned his dread in whiskey. The house grew heavy, its rooms cold no matter the fire, and Emily herself. She seemed less like a child and more like a vessel, a doorway. She stopped eating, she stopped sleeping, yet she remained awake, her eyes wide, her hands trembling as though gripped by invisible fingers. Once, when Margaret tried to comfort her, Emily said in a flat, detached tone, "They are not asking any more, they are demanding." The Crawfords considered leaving Millhaven, but they knew, deep down, that the voices would follow because they were not tied to the house or the town, they were tied to Emily. One cold October morning, Jonathan awoke to find his wife gone. Her sewing kit sat open on the table, her shawl still hung by the door. There were no footprints in the frost outside, no signs of struggle. Emily sat at the kitchen table, humming to herself. When Jonathan demanded to know where Margaret had gone, Emily tilted her head and whispered, "She went back to where they keep the others." Jonathan shook her, desperate, but Emily's eyes were blank, fixed on some point beyond him. Days passed with no word. A search party combed the woods, the rivers, the old mill. Nothing. And then, weeks later, scraps of fabric. Margaret's shawl were found near the foundation of the abandoned orphanage. The building was sealed shut. No one dared break it open. Jonathan began drinking heavily, leaving Emily alone for long stretches. Neighbors claimed they saw her walking at night among the gravestones, whispering to shadows that answered back. Millhaven tightened its silence. One by one, the people who knew the truth chose not to speak, because by now everyone feared what Emily might reveal next. Jonathan Crawford was once respected, a craftsman whose ironwork held the town together. But after Margaret's disappearance, he became a ghost of a man. He spent his nights at the tavern muttering to himself, his hands trembling too violently to hold tools. The neighbors whispered that he had struck a bargain, that in exchange for silence about Emily, he had given his wife to the same forces that now lived inside his daughter. But Jonathan himself denied nothing. He only said, "She knows more than I ever could, and it isn't meant for men to hear." Emily, left to wander the house alone, grew thinner, her hair dull and falling in clumps. But her eyes burned with an unnatural brightness, as though lit from behind. One evening, Jonathan staggered home drunk and heard his daughter speaking in the parlor. He thought she was alone until he pushed open the door. The chairs were all occupied, empty but occupied, their shapes pressed faintly into the cushions, the wood groaning under invisible weight. Emily sat at the head of the table, smiling faintly. "They don't like you," she said softly to her father. "Not yet." Jonathan stumbled back, whispering prayers he no longer believed in. Word of Emily spread beyond Millhaven. In Philadelphia, the theological seminary received a letter not from the Crawfords, but from the Reverend Whittaker before his disappearance. The letter warned of a child prophet, whose visions threatened to expose the sins of the clergy themselves. The seminary dispatched 2 men to investigate, a theologian named Father Elias Brandt and a young scholar, Thomas Harrow. They arrived in Millhaven late November, posing as travelers. But the townsfolk knew who they were and kept their mouths shut. When they met Emily, she regarded them without fear. She looked at Father Brandt and whispered, "The cellar, 3 girls, you prayed while they screamed." Brandt went pale, sweat soaking through his collar. Harrow tried to intervene, but Emily only smiled at him. "And you," she whispered, "are already mine." The men left the Crawford home shaken, but they did not leave Millhaven. They set up camp at the church, insisting they would contain the child. Behind closed doors, they discussed options not of healing, but of removal. By December of 1872, Millhaven was suffocating under Emily's shadow. Crops rotted in the fields despite clear skies. Wells turned brackish. A child was found drowned in a trough, though no one had seen him approach it, and still Emily spoke. At night, her voice echoed across the town, though her mouth never moved. Men heard their names whispered in their wives' ears. Women heard their own secrets recited by their infants in voices not their own. The townspeople began to petition for her removal. They approached Jonathan, who laughed bitterly. "You think she belongs to me? She belongs to all of you. She's only telling what you've done." In desperation, the town council called for a secret meeting inside the church basement, but Emily was already there. She stood barefoot on the stone floor, her hair wild, her face pale as chalk. "They don't want meetings," she said in a voice that came from everywhere at once. "They want to be seen." The council fled in terror. The next morning, 3 of their homes burned to the ground. In the final days of December, the long, abandoned orphanage of St. Agnes, boarded and locked for years, was found with its doors wide open. No footprints in the snow led to it. No tools had forced its locks. Children claimed they heard singing from inside, dozens of voices, all in Emily's cadence. Jonathan forbade Emily from going near the place, but one night she vanished from her bed. He found her inside the orphanage chapel, sitting calmly on the altar. Around her, the pews were filled, not with living children, but with outlines, shadows, the suggestion of faces half formed and flickering. "They've been waiting," she whispered when Jonathan tried to drag her away, "and now they want more." The smell of rot and incense filled the air. Jonathan staggered outside, retching, his mind breaking beneath the weight of what he had seen. From that night on, the orphanage was no longer avoided. It was feared, because anyone who entered heard their own sins sung back to them in the high, delicate voices of children. And the voice leading them all was Emily's. In January of 1873, Father Brandt announced he would purge Emily Crawford. The townsfolk gathered in the church, not out of faith, but fear. They wanted resolution and end anything that might silence the girl. Emily was bound to a chair at the center of the chapel. Candles burned, prayers were shouted, Latin chanted. But the moment Brandt pressed the crucifix to her forehead, Emily began to laugh, not the laugh of a child. A deep, guttural cackle that reverberated off the wooden beams until the whole building seemed alive with it. "You confess with your lips, but not your hands," she hissed. "Shall I show them what your hands have done?" Brant dropped the crucifix, trembling. His skin blistered where it had touched her. The congregation fled in terror, screaming as windows shattered and hymns turned to screams. When the smoke cleared, Emily still sat bound to the chair, calm, smiling, her eyes white and glowing in the darkness. The church never held another service. Thomas Harrow, the seminary scholar, should have fled Millhaven, but he didn't. He began visiting Emily in secret, bringing notebooks, sketching diagrams of her words, her gestures, the strange symbols she carved into the wood with her fingernails. He told himself it was for knowledge, for theology, for science. But in truth, he was enthralled. He wrote in his journal, "Her voice is not a voice but a chorus of memory. She does not speak to the dead. She is the dead." Harrow stopped sleeping. He muttered to himself, scratching Emily's words across the walls of his rented room until his fingers bled. One night he did not arrive at the Crawfords' home with a journal but with a knife. He knelt before Emily and whispered, "Tell me what to do." Emily took the blade from his hand, pressed it to his throat, and smiled. "You are already doing it." Days later, Harrow's body was found in the river. His notebooks, waterlogged, contained nothing but pages upon pages of names. Names of Millhaven's dead. Names no outsider could have known. The town council could no longer deny it. Millhaven was unraveling, crops gone, livestock dead, families fleeing in the night, children speaking in voices not their own. So they devised a final plan. Emily would be removed, taken in secret to the woods, bound and left to die. Jonathan resisted at first, but his will was broken. He signed the paper that gave them consent, weeping into his hands. He told himself it was mercy, that no child should bear what Emily bore. The night they came for her, Emily did not fight. She looked at each man in turn, speaking their sins aloud with precision, cruelty, and delight. One soiled himself. Another fell to his knees, begging forgiveness. Still, they dragged her into the forest, gagged her, and bound her to a tree. The snow fell heavy, swallowing the sound of her muffled laughter. The men returned to town certain it was over, but none of them slept that night. Their dreams were filled with voices, and by dawn they realized the truth. Emily had never been left behind. She was already back. January 27, 1873. The night Millhaven remembers only in whispers. Emily walked the streets barefoot, her white dress torn, her skin pale as moonlight. Every house she passed erupted in screams. Husbands collapsing as their wives accused them of infidelities only Emily could have known. Mothers confessing to smothered infants. Children shrieking of visions of graves opening beneath their beds. Dogs howled until their throats tore. The church bell rang, though no one touched the rope. By midnight, half the town had fled into the woods, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. The others barricaded their doors, whispering prayers into the dark. And Emily, she stood in the center of town square, eyes glowing, arms outstretched, her small body vibrating with voices that poured from her in waves. "They will not let you hide any more," she roared in a voice that was not her own. "You belong to them, all of you." The sky itself seemed to shudder, and Millhaven was never the same again. Jonathan Crawford could no longer deny what his daughter had become. He returned home that night with a length of rope and a bottle of whiskey, whispering to himself that he would end it, that no man should allow his own blood to poison the world. But when he entered the house, Emily was waiting. She sat calmly at the table, her eyes bright, her voice steady. "You cannot hang me, father," she said. "You would only be hanging yourself." Jonathan dropped the rope. He fell to his knees, sobbing, clawing at his face as though trying to rip away his own skin. Emily stood, placed her small hand on his head, and whispered a single word no one else would ever hear. By dawn, Jonathan was dead, his body found hanging in the barn, not by rope, but by iron chains twisted into impossible knots, the kind no human hands could tie. And Emily, she walked the town roads alone, untouched, unafraid, her bare feet leaving no mark in the snow. When word reached Philadelphia, the seminary could no longer ignore it. A larger delegation was dispatched, 3 priests, a physician, and 2 men from the state. They arrived with journals, restraints, and tools meant not for healing, but for dissection. They found Millhaven half abandoned, its houses gutted, its wells poisoned. And in the Crawford home they found Emily. She welcomed them. "You've come to finish what he could not." she said, her eyes fixed on Father Brandt's crucifix, still scorched from the failed exorcism. The men bound her, gagged her, and carried her away. Townsfolk claimed they heard her laughter for miles, echoing through the hills long after the carriage disappeared. But the delegation never returned. Their wagon was found splintered in the woods weeks later, horses dead, journals scattered, every page blank. Not a trace of Emily nor the men was ever seen again. In the months that followed, Millhaven collapsed, families fled, the church was burned, the orphanage crumbled in on itself. By summer, the town was a skeleton. Fields overgrown, homes empty, a silence so deep it seemed carved into the soil. And Emily Crawford's name was struck from every record. Church registers, census rolls, school ledgers, all altered. Her photograph vanished from archives. Whispers said the seminary orchestrated the erasure, buying silence with money and threats. Others said it was Emily herself, erasing not only her presence but her absence, consuming memory as easily as breath. By the turn of the century, Millhaven was gone from maps. Travelers who asked were met with blank stares. The land was farmland again, but no family stayed longer than a season. The soil was rich, but it did not forgive. Only one relic survived, the photograph. Emily seated stiffly in her chair, hands folded, eyes too sharp for a child. Behind her, the blurred figures, their faces stretched and wrong, waiting. The photograph has changed over the years. Those who have studied it claim the background shifts. New figures appear, old ones vanish. Some say Margaret now stands behind Emily. Some swear Jonathan hangs in the corner of the frame, and still at the center Emily sits watching, her faint smile unchanged. No one knows where she went. No one knows what she became, but those who look long enough into the photograph say they hear her, a voice behind the ear, a whisper in the bones, not of the past, not of the dead, but of what waits, patient and hungry, in the silence we dare not name.